California, 1943, Lockheed Airfield, Burbank. A silver blur slices through the sky, sunlight flashing off its twin booms as it plunges toward the earth at over 500 miles an hour. Inside the cockpit, the pilot's hands tremble against the yoke, the airframe shudders violently, the nose drops harder, his instruments spin, the stick won't move, he's trapped. Below him, the California desert rushes upward, tan, empty, endless. He pulls. Nothing. The controls are frozen solid. For a moment, the new P-38 Lightning, America's pride, becomes a coffin with wings. Then, at the very edge of death, something changes. A flick of metal hidden beneath the wing deploys, and suddenly the plane breathes. The dive slows. The nose rises. The aircraft levels out just a few hundred feet above the sand. The pilot exhales for the first time in 30 seconds. He doesn't know it yet. But this small piece of metal, this civilian-designed trick, has just saved his life, and hundreds more to come. Far below, in a Lockheed hangar filled with cigarette smoke and blueprints, a group of engineers, none of them soldiers, watch the horizon. Their creation has finally survived the sky. When the Lockheed P-38 Lightning first took to the skies in January 1939, it looked like nothing else in the world. Twin engines, twin booms, a central nacelle holding the cockpit and cannons. Its silhouette alone declared that this was no ordinary aircraft. It was a leap forward, a vision of speed and range that would define the next generation of fighters. And it hadn't come from the military. It had come from civilians. A young, driven engineer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, just 29 years old, led a small team at the Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, a company better known for commercial planes than war machines. When the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a challenge for a new interceptor capable of 360 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, Johnson's team sketched something radical. Not a single-engine fighter like the Curtiss P-40 or the Bell P-39, but a twin-engine monster built for both speed and endurance. By mid-1939, the prototype XP-38 had shattered the transcontinental speed record, flying coast to coast in just over 7 hours. The press hailed it as America's Lightning. The future of aerial warfare, they said, was here. But the future was about to bite back. The first production P-38s entered service in 1941, sleek, fast, and heavily armed with 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. The Lightning looked unstoppable on paper. Then pilots started dying. The aircraft's unique design gave it extraordinary range and power, but also new aerodynamic problems no one fully understood. When P-38s dove at high speed, they sometimes refused to pull out. Control surfaces froze, elevator pressure vanished, the nose locked down. Pilots would fight their sticks until the last second, and then vanish into the ground. The cause was mysterious. Engines, hydraulics, balance, all tested, all fine. Yet time and again, reports came back the same. Aircraft entered a dive and failed to recover. Lockheed engineers began calling it the demon in the dive. By late 1942, the pattern was undeniable. Test flights ended in tragedy. Training accidents mounted. In combat zones, especially over the European Alps and the Pacific Islands, young pilots were told unofficially, "If your P-38 starts to dive, pray." The term was new, barely understood, compressibility. At high speeds, as aircraft approached the sound barrier, airflow around the wings began to behave differently. Pressure zones shifted. Shock waves formed along the upper wing surfaces. Control effectiveness vanished. The P-38, with its long, thin wings and heavy twin-boom design, was one of the first planes fast enough to experience it. But in 1942, no one, not the Air Corps, not the British, not even Lockheed, truly grasped what was happening. In reality, the aircraft was flying into transonic flight regimes, areas where airflow approached the speed of sound, producing localized shock waves that rendered the elevators useless. Pilots weren't failing to pull up. Physics itself was locking them out. The lightning was too fast for its own time. Word spread through pilot training schools. The P-38 was a marvel at altitude, deadly in climb and range, but unpredictable in a dive. Some called it cursed. Others refused to fly it in combat without restrictions. One young pilot wrote in his logbook after surviving a dive, "I thought I'd found the limit." The airplane decided otherwise. The Army demanded answers. The pressure on Lockheed grew unbearable. But for Kelly Johnson and his team, this wasn't just about military contracts, it was personal. Each pilot who died was flying an idea they had created, and it was failing them. The engineers at Burbank doubled their shifts. They built wind tunnels out of spare materials, studied film footage frame by frame, and pored over reports of flight paths and wreckage. The solution, if there was one, would not come from generals or bureaucrats. It would come from civilian minds, a handful of young men in shirt sleeves, armed only with pencils, slide rules, and intuition. By 1943, the P-38's reputation was on the line. In Europe, it was being replaced by P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs for bomber escort duties. In the Pacific, where range mattered more, it remained indispensable, but fragile. Every high-speed engagement carried a risk of sudden death. Lockheed's test pilots refused to give up. One of them, Tony Levier, took it upon himself to dive the aircraft again and again, deliberately pushing it to its limits. Each time he returned shaken and more determined. "We're not losing this plane," Levier told Johnson. "We just haven't learned how to fly it yet." It wasn't courage that would save them. It was understanding. Something in the air, something invisible, was stealing control. And someone had to find a way to take it back. In the summer of 1943, as losses mounted and pilots' confidence in the P-38 began to waver, the solution arrived not from a general's command or a classified military lab, but from a civilian engineering office tucked inside Lockheed's Burbank facility. The name was Ben Kelsey, a civilian test pilot and engineer working under the larger umbrella of Kelly Johnson's design team. He wasn't famous. He didn't wear a uniform. But what he brought to the table would change everything. He proposed a fix that seemed almost absurd in its simplicity. Small, deployable dive recovery flaps mounted beneath each wing, just behind the main landing gear. The theory? When activated during a high-speed dive, these flaps would alter the pressure distribution and airflow over the tail surfaces, restoring elevator control and breaking the deadly grip of compressibility. They wouldn't increase engine power. They wouldn't change the plane's aerodynamics in normal flight. They would only deploy in dives, and only when needed. Many doubted it would work. Some ridiculed the idea outright. But Kelly Johnson didn't. He signed off on immediate wind tunnel tests and experimental retrofitting. And in October 1943, the first modified P-38, equipped with dive flaps based on a civilian engineer's sketch, took to the sky. The pilot was Tony Levier, Lockheed's veteran test flyer who had already survived more P-38 dives than most could imagine. The mission was clear. Fly to 30,000 feet, enter a full-power dive, and deploy the flaps at terminal velocity. Cameras rolled. Engineers stood silently on the tarmac. They knew what was at stake. At 500 miles per hour, the P-38 began to tremble, the same vibration, the same loss of elevator response. For a moment, it was as if nothing had changed. Then Levier activated the flaps. Instantly, the nose began to lift. Elevator pressure returned. The airframe stabilized. The Lightning pulled out of the dive with ease, banking cleanly back toward Burbank Airfield. He landed without a word, removed his oxygen mask, and walked straight into the hangar. "It works," he said. "We've got it." And with that, the P-38's greatest flaw, the demon in the dive, had been exorcised. News of the fix spread quickly through the Air Corps. P-38 squadrons in Europe and the Pacific received upgrade kits. Field modifications were rushed into production. By early 1944, the majority of active P-38s were equipped with the dive recovery system. The results were immediate and dramatic. Pilots who once feared vertical combat now embraced it. Dive attacks, once suicidal, became a tactical advantage. Japanese Zeros and German FW-19s that had counted on high-speed dives to escape, or trap, Lightning pilots now found themselves hunted instead. For the first time since its introduction, the P-38 wasn't fighting against its own airframe. It was free, and it was deadly. The dive recovery flap was more than a mechanical fix. It marked a shift in how engineers thought about aircraft performance, not as static traits, but as problems to be dynamically solved in real-time flight. The idea that a plane could change its own aerodynamic behavior mid-dive, not with power, but with precision control of airflow, was revolutionary. This mindset would go on to inform every major post-war design. The swept-wing jets of the Korean War, the supersonic control surfaces of the F-104 starfighter, the variable geometry wings of Cold War bombers, even the aerodynamic trickery behind modern stealth aircraft. But it all began here, with a civilian engineer, a hand-drawn sketch, and a simple flap that caught the air just enough to restore control. The U.S. Army Air Forces didn't invent the solution. They didn't even fully understand the problem. It was Lockheed civilians, engineers and designers working off instinct, wind tunnel data, and a deep understanding of airflow, who corrected the deadliest flaw in America's most radical fighter. Their success reinforced a wartime truth. Civilian innovation often moved faster than military doctrine. While generals argued over tactics and procurement timelines, Johnson's team was solving real problems in real time. The P-38's dive recovery system wasn't just a technical triumph. It was a symbol of the civilian contribution to modern war. And it worked not because it was complex, but because it was elegant. A trick of the wind. A piece of metal that changed a plane's fate, and with it, the fate of those who flew it. Before the fix, the P-38 Lightning was a paradox. Pilots loved its firepower, its range, its climb rate. It was stable, deadly, and futuristic. But they feared it, not because of the enemy, but because of the plane itself. It was a fear few spoke of openly. You couldn't afford to question your aircraft in front of your squadron. You just hoped the day didn't come when you had to dive. Many remembered Lieutenant Rex Barber, one of the P-38's most famous aces. In combat over the Pacific, he once entered a high-speed dive to chase a fleeing Japanese fighter, only to feel the controls lock in his hands. The stick wouldn't budge. He felt the pressure building in his ears. The altimeter spun. He braced for impact. But at the last moment, turbulence rocked the aircraft just enough to lift the nose. He lived. The Zero didn't. Others weren't so lucky. Reports trickled in from both theaters. Pilots lost in training. Aircraft found in craters with no sign of enemy engagement. The common thread? High-altitude dives. Controls frozen. No recovery. In that era, there was no ejection seat. If your dive went bad, you died with the aircraft. One pilot described it simply, "The P-38 didn't kill you in combat. It killed you on the way down." What the pilots were facing wasn't a defect, it was physics catching up to aviation. As the P-38 approached Mach 0.65 to 0.75 in a dive, it entered a regime where air could no longer move smoothly over the aircraft's surfaces. Shockwaves formed over the wings and tail. These altered the pressure zones so drastically that the elevator, the control surface that pitches the nose up or down, became ineffective. It didn't break, it just stopped working. Worse still, the P-38's twin-boom design made the issue more pronounced. The central nacelle caused turbulent flow around the tailplane. As the dive continued, center of pressure shifted forward, and the nose dropped further, accelerating the problem. This phenomenon was called compressibility stall, though it had nothing to do with engines. It was a purely aerodynamic crisis, and no one had seen it coming. Before the war, few aircraft had ever flown fast enough to experience it, but the P-38 could dive from altitude with such weight and power that it frequently became the first aircraft in human history to hit this invisible wall. It was uncharted territory, and men were dying just for crossing into it. When the dive recovery flap was introduced, it didn't eliminate compressibility. That would remain a constant in high-speed flight. What it did was shift the aircraft's behavior just enough to recenter airflow and restore elevator authority. The flaps themselves were small, little more than hinged metal plates under each wing. But when deployed at high speeds, they created just enough additional drag and lift to pull the nose back up. Not through brute force, but by changing how the air moved across the surfaces. This was engineering at its most elegant, not overpowering the laws of physics, but outsmarting them. The psychological impact on pilots was immediate. Once the recovery system was in place, squadrons reported a massive drop in unexplained losses during dives. Pilots began using vertical maneuvers with confidence. Aggressive tactics returned. The P-38 went from being a climber and cruiser to a true high-speed hunter. Suddenly, Lightning pilots could match German FW-190s and Me-109s in steep dives. In the Pacific, they could pursue Zeros straight down, where previously they would have broken off. Morale soared. One squadron commander over New Guinea radioed back after the first successful dive kill with a modified Lightning. She held. All the way down. Never thought I'd live to say that the war didn't slow down, but the aircraft, and the men inside it, finally caught up. Before the dive recovery flap, the P-38 was a plane of contradictions. It was fast, but feared. Powerful, but unpredictable. After the fix, it became a tactical cornerstone in two very different theaters of war. In Europe, where the skies were thick with flak and Luftwaffe interceptors, American bombers desperately needed long-range fighter escort. The P-38, with its twin engines, redundant systems, and extended range, was ideal for deep penetration missions, able to accompany B-17 and B-24 farther than any other fighter, at least until the Mustang arrived. But it was in the Pacific Theater, where islands were scattered and airstrips were few, that the P-38 truly dominated. The Lightning's combat radius of 1,100 miles allowed it to strike Japanese bases, support amphibious landings, and perform long-range reconnaissance missions, all without carrier support. It was the only American fighter capable of hitting the enemy at extended distance and returning safely, often flying solo missions deep into enemy territory. And now, with the dive recovery flap installed, it could also fight vertically, diving hard on enemy formations and climbing out with full control. This single modification unlocked the third dimension for P-38 pilots. Perhaps the most famous mission showcasing the Lightning's new capabilities was Operation Vengeance on April 18, 1943. A mission to intercept and assassinate Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind behind Pearl Harbor. Though this occurred just before the widespread adoption of the dive recovery flap, it revealed what made the P-38 indispensable: long-range precision strike. Flying over 435 miles of open ocean at treetop level to avoid radar detection, a formation of 18 P-38s reached the precise coordinates where Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber would appear. With just minutes to spare, they engaged. The mission was a success. Yamamoto was killed. The Japanese Navy's morale never recovered. Later variants of the Lightning, equipped with the dive flap and turbo-supercharged engines, would only become more deadly in such roles, striking Japanese supply convoys, decimating airfields, and eliminating enemy aces. The P-38 had evolved from an experiment into a surgical tool of war. Early in the war, both Axis and Allied pilots had mocked the Lightning. Its shape, twin tails, central nacelle, was unlike anything else. Luftwaffe pilots called it der Gabelschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil, not out of fear but curiosity. They had encountered few in the early European campaigns, and those they met seemed limited, vulnerable in dives. But by late 1943, that perception changed. Reports from the Mediterranean noted P-38S diving aggressively into German formations and climbing back out before enemy fighters could respond. In Italy, bomber groups repeatedly credited Lightning escorts with breaking up interception attempts before they reached the bombers. The key shift wasn't just physical, it was behavioral. The aircraft no longer retreated from dives, it no longer hesitated to engage. And that told enemy pilots something chilling. The Lightning now had nothing to fear. In the Pacific, Japanese Zeros, which had once turned and outclimbed most American fighters, now struggled to keep pace. P-38 seconds could outgun them, outrun them, and now outdive them. The Japanese began to avoid Lightning formations altogether, preferring to attack P-40 or F-4Fs when possible. A weapon that once drew ridicule now drew respect and avoidance. For the men who flew the P-38, the transformation was more than mechanical. It was emotional. Pilots reported feeling a renewed sense of trust in their aircraft. Training focused on vertical maneuvers, combat dives, and energy tactics. The Lightning became a machine you could ride to the edge of control and still come home from. In post-war interviews, aces like Thomas Maguire, Charles Lindbergh, who flew combat missions as a civilian advisor, and Richard Bong, America's highest-scoring ace with 40 kills, all credited the P-38's design with their survival, and all benefited from the dive recovery fix that had arrived just in time. What started as a sketch in a Lockheed office became a new form of control in aerial warfare. By giving pilots the confidence to dive, the dive flap opened new options for engagement, evasion, and pursuit. It wasn't just a safety measure, it was a tactical enabler, and every doctrine written about the P-38 after 1944 accounted for its improved dive behavior. What it proved was profound. Engineering could solve fear. Design could change behavior. And sometimes, a simple flap of metal could do more than firepower ever could. It was November 1943. The war in the Pacific was intensifying. American bombers were being shot out of the sky over Rabaul and New Guinea. Fighter escorts needed more than just range. They needed maneuverability, survivability, and speed at every altitude. Back in the Mojave Desert, at a dry lakebed called Muroc Field, what would later become Edwards Air Force Base, the P-38 was about to face its most dangerous test. The aircraft had been retrofitted with a new, unproven system. 2 small dive recovery flaps mounted under the wings. Simple in design. Radical in purpose. The pilot was Tony Levier, Lockheed's most experienced test flyer. He had already survived multiple compressibility dives. He understood what the aircraft could and couldn't do. This time, he was betting everything on a sliver of metal and airflow. On the ground, Kelly Johnson and his team waited in silence. No applause, no cameras, just engineers with binoculars holding their breath. Levier climbed to 35,000 feet in clear desert sky. At the edge of American airspace, he leveled off, rolled inverted, and pushed the nose down, hard. The P-38 dropped like a stone. The twin Allisons roared, speed built, 480 miles per hour, then 500 miles per hour. Then came the tremble. Levier had been here before. The elevator went soft, the yoke unresponsive, the nose locked down. He triggered the flaps. There was a split second, a moment of nothing, and then lift. The nose rose, the tail came alive, the stick moved, the aircraft responded. The Lightning leveled out, controlled, stable, alive. For the first time in history, a fighter had dove into compressibility and returned intact by design. He radioed back to Burbank. "I'm fine. It works. Tell Kelly we did it." And somewhere in that Lockheed office, a pencil sketch pinned to a corkboard became legend. After Leviere's test flight, Lockheed immediately reported the results to the U.S. Army Air Forces. The findings were undeniable. Dive flaps reduced recovery altitudes by thousands of feet. Pilots reported full elevator authority restored. Structural loads were well within tolerances. The Army approved mass retrofitting of dive recovery flaps on all P-38 models starting in early 1944. Combat groups already in the field were prioritized. By March, pilots in the 5th Air Force and 8th Air Force began flying with the modification, some barely aware of how close they had come to disaster in previous missions. What changed in combat was immediate. Pilots began using high-speed slashing attacks from altitude, knowing they could recover safely. Escorts over Germany and Italy engaged Luftwaffe interceptors in vertical dogfights. In the Pacific, pilots chased enemy bombers all the way down, often into the sea, and returned alive. It wasn't just an upgrade. It was the moment the P-38 became complete. Before the fix, the P-38's greatest flaw had lived in the back of the pilot's mind. Every dive held danger. Every moment beyond 400 miles per hour was a question mark. But now, that fear was gone. One ace, flying out of New Guinea, later recalled, "We stopped thinking about the dive. We just flew. That little flap meant we could stop fighting the airplane and start fighting the enemy." That shift, from hesitancy to confidence, made the P-38 more than a weapon. It made it a partner in survival. Axis pilots noticed the change. In the Mediterranean, German fighter groups reported increased aggressiveness from P-38 squadrons, especially in vertical maneuvers. Where once the Lightning broke off engagements, now it pushed deeper. It climbed, dove, and didn't hesitate. Luftwaffe commanders initially suspected new engines or lighter airframes. They didn't understand that it was not more power, but smarter airflow, that had made the difference. In the Pacific, Japanese reports began noting that P-38s descended with more speed and did not crash after pursuit. The Zeros, already struggling with inferior armor and climb rate, now had no advantage in dive or escape. The Lightning had taken the one vulnerability its enemies relied on and removed it. Quietly. Elegantly. Completely. In every war there is a turning point, not just in strategy or firepower, but in understanding. For the P-38, that turning point came not in combat, but in the high desert silence of a test flight, a moment where death had once lived and was denied by a flap of metal and a man who wouldn't give up. What followed wasn't just victory, it was vindication. By early 1944, the skies over Europe and the Pacific had shifted. The Allies were no longer just reacting. They were pressing forward. Bombing raids grew in scale. Amphibious invasions stormed ashore on island after island. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, and Japan's supply lines were withering. But none of it was guaranteed. Every mile gained had to be flown. Fought, survived. And now, the P-38 Lightning had become one of the few aircraft capable of doing all three. With its dive recovery system fully deployed across combat groups, the P-38 had finally become what Lockheed engineers had envisioned from the start, a long-range, high-speed, multi-role air dominance platform. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, had long struggled to escort its bombers deep into Germany. Earlier Lightning missions had been cut short by mechanical failures, fuel limits, or dive-related losses. But after the dive fix, and with improved superchargers and drop tanks, the P-38 returned to the battlefield. And this time, it stayed. During the Big Week bombing campaign in February 1944, American P-38s flew as far as Leipzig, Schweinfurt, and Regensburg, taking on F-190 and Me-190-109S at high altitudes, engaging and surviving vertical maneuvers that had once spelled death. In one day alone, the 55th Fighter Group, flying modified P-38s, claimed 16 Luftwaffe fighters for the loss of just 2 aircraft, both pilots surviving bailout over Allied lines. The Lightning had matured, no longer experimental, no longer doubted. Its dive now brought death to the enemy, not to its own. But it was in the vast, blue silence of the Pacific that the P-38's full potential was realized. With the dive recovery flap now standard, P-38s could dive through weather, evade enemy traps, and hit targets at treetop level without fear of structural loss. Missions that were once borderline suicidal now became routine. Pilots like Major Richard Bong, flying with the 49th Fighter Group, began to rack up kills in rapid succession. Bong's P-38, Marge, named after his sweetheart, became an icon, and he himself became America's top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills, nearly all in the Lightning. In one engagement over the Philippines, Bong dove on a formation of Japanese bombers protected by escort fighters. Before the dive flap, such a maneuver would have been a one-way trip: lose control, overspeed, stall out. Instead, Bong dropped through cloud cover, intercepted at 450 miles per hour, broke up the formation, and climbed out before the enemy could even react. His secret? The flap, the fix, the trust in his machine. By the time the Allies began retaking the Philippines and striking Formosa in late 1944, the P-38 had become a nightmare to the Japanese High Command. It wasn't just the aircraft's range, it was the precision with which it could now engage from altitude, choosing the moment and direction of attack, and recovering with authority. Naval bases, airfields, supply ships all came under lightning fire. Reconnaissance variants of the P-38, stripped of armament but retaining the dive flaps, mapped enemy islands at treetop altitude. When flak opened up, they dove, and survived. In January 1945, during pre-invasion operations for Iwo Jima, P-38s with the 7th Fighter Command escorted B-24 bombers over heavily defended territory. When a Japanese air ambush struck, the P-38s dove to intercept, outmaneuvering the enemy, destroying 12 aircraft, and returning with minimal losses. There was no doubt anymore. The P-38 was not just an escort, not just a dogfighter. It was a complete combat platform. By 1945, German and Japanese forces had learned to avoid lightning formations when possible. In Europe, Messerschmitt pilots reported that the fork-tailed fighters now attacked in vertical slashes, coordinated with wingmen, and could not be easily shaken. In the Pacific, Japanese pilots referred to it simply as the Long Fighter, a reference to both its appearance and its reach. No longer was the Lightning considered fragile or quirky. Now it was feared. The dive, once the P-38's weakness, had become its signature. A maneuver that once killed pilots now saved them and destroyed the enemy. As the war moved into its final year, the P-38 held a unique place in Allied air strategy. It escorted bombers farther than any other fighter. It could dive, climb, and fight at high altitude. It could deliver bombs, rockets, and strafing fire. It could operate in the most remote, poorly maintained airstrips of the Pacific. And crucially, it could survive high-speed combat that destroyed other aircraft. The dive recovery flap was not a footnote. It was the hinge on which all of this turned. Without it, the Lightning may have faded from the front lines. With it, it became the last thing the enemy heard before fire tore through the sky. When World War II ended in August 1945, the skies were filled with new machines, jet aircraft, pressurized cabins, rockets and radar. But few aircraft had carried more weight, literally and figuratively, than the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. From the jungles of New Guinea to the skies over Berlin, the Lightning had flown farther, fought longer, and changed more minds than almost any other Allied fighter. It had entered the war as a futuristic experiment. It ended it as a veteran of every major aerial campaign the United States fought. Over 10,000 P-38s were produced between 1941 and 1945, making it one of the most mass-produced fighters of the war. It served in every combat theater, from the Aleutians to Italy to Burma. It was responsible for the destruction of more than 1,800 Japanese aircraft in the Pacific alone. It was the only U.S. fighter aircraft in continuous production throughout America's entire involvement in World War II. It was flown by America's top two aces, O Major Richard Bong, 40 confirmed kills, a Major Thomas Maguire, 38 confirmed kills. Both men flew the P-38 almost exclusively, and both paid the ultimate price, not from enemy superiority, but from the extreme risks of flying and fighting at the edge of physics. What made the P-38 different from other fighters, even the highly revered P-51 Mustang, was its versatility. It wasn't just a dogfighter. It could carry bombs, rockets, and drop tanks. It could perform photo reconnaissance at 30,000 feet or nap-of-the-earth runs over enemy airfields. It could climb with the Spitfire, dive with the Thunderbolt, and cruise longer than almost anything in the air. And in many ways, the dive recovery flap had unlocked all of that. Without the ability to dive and recover safely, vertical engagements were suicidal. Bombing runs that required escape dives were limited. Tactical flexibility was chained to survivability. Once fixed, those chains fell away, and the P-38 became strategically indispensable. As the Allies pressed into the Philippines and began bombing Formosa and Okinawa, the P-38 took on its most valuable role yet: long-range interdiction. Flying hundreds of miles ahead of bomber formations, P-38s would hit rail yards, bridges, coastal supply depots, and communications hubs, softening targets before the main strike arrived. In these roles, dive precision was critical. P-38 pilots needed to attack from high altitude, drop ordnance accurately, then escape at high speed through hostile airspace. With the dive flap, they could control every inch of that descent, keeping aim true and escape possible. It was surgical war, and the lightning was the scalpel. Ask any pilot who flew the P-38 after the dive fix, and a pattern emerges: trust. Before the flap, the lightning was like a powerful animal that could turn on its rider. Afterward, it was still a beast, but one you could tame. Pilots didn't just admire it. They loved it. They wrote its name on the nose. They decorated the nacelle with shark teeth, pin-up art, and mission tallies. In the Pacific especially, where distances were vast and help far away, the P-38 was often the only thing between a pilot and the sea. It carried them out. And now, finally, it could bring them back down. Safely. Lockheed's solution, and the philosophy behind it, would echo through the decades. The concept of aerodynamic control innovation, of modifying the airflow rather than the powertrain, would become central to Cold War aviation. Aircraft like the F-104 Starfighter, the U-2 Dragon Lady, and eventually the SR-71 Blackbird, all products of Kelly Johnson's later Skunk Works team, were descendants of the P-38 mindset. Each of them flew faster, higher, or farther than anything before them. But each also carried the lesson of the lightning. You must solve the air before you can conquer it. And the first to truly solve it was the P-38. In wartime stories, the names we remember are often those who flew, fought, or commanded. But the P-38 Lightning, and especially the fix that saved it, was born of minds outside the battlefield. Men like Kelly Johnson, Ben Kelsey, and Tony LaVere never wore stars on their shoulders. Their war was not fought from the cockpit, but from drafting tables, wind tunnels, and desert airstrips. And yet, their contribution changed everything. The dive recovery flap, designed not by a military committee, but by civilian engineers working on instinct and aerodynamic theory, proved that civilian innovation could outpace military doctrine. It was a moment when pencil sketches mattered more than protocol. It laid the foundation for a new era of American air power, one where the military trusted engineers to lead the way into the unknown, even before generals understood what needed solving. After the war, the engineers behind the P-38 would not fade away. Kelly Johnson, who had overseen the dive recovery fix and personally approved its testing, went on to found Lockheed's Skunk Works, the most secretive and revolutionary aircraft design team in history. Under his leadership, they would produce the U-2 spy plane, which flew higher than any fighter could intercept, the A-12 and SR-71 Blackbird, which set world records for speed, altitude, and endurance. The F-117 Nighthawk, America's first operational stealth aircraft. Each of these machines carried the DNA of the P-38, unconventional shapes, radical flight profiles, trust in airflow mastery, solutions born in notebooks, not committees, and each bore the same belief that had once saved the Lightning. No problem in aviation is unsolvable if you listen to the air. Yet for all its achievements, the P-38 Lightning didn't enter the post-war pantheon with the fame of the Mustang or the Spitfire. There were reasons. Its twin-engine layout was more expensive to maintain in peacetime. The Mustang, simpler and faster at lower altitude, became the poster child of American air power. Jet aircraft quickly pushed all piston designs into obsolescence. By the late 1940s, most surviving P-38s were scrapped, sold for parts, or left to rust on remote Pacific islands. Unlike the iconic P-51, which remained in service with other nations well into the 1950s, the Lightning quietly disappeared from frontline service. Its fame dimmed, its silhouette vanished from air shows, its story, and especially the civilian trick that saved it, faded from public memory. For the men who flew it, the Lightning was unforgettable, its growl, its weight, its grace in the air. And after the fix, its trustworthiness in the dive. They remembered not just the missions, but the feeling that when they nosed over into enemy territory, there was nothing between them and death except the controls in their hands. And the engineers who made sure those controls would answer back. Veterans' memoirs speak of the P-38 with reverence, not like a tool, but like a companion. One pilot wrote, "The P-38 was like flying a promise. Once it learned how to recover from a dive, it promised to bring you home." And it did. The dive recovery flap was not glamorous. It wasn't flashy. It didn't roar or fire bullets. It was a flat piece of metal, hinged under the wing. But in the story of aerial warfare, that little flap was as important as any engine or weapon. It turned the P-38 from a flawed experiment into a combat legend. It restored trust. It saved lives. It redefined what a fighter could do. And perhaps most importantly, it proved this truth. Sometimes history changes not with a bang, but with a slight shift in airflow. In war, we often remember the roar of engines, the thunder of guns, and the men who charged into danger. But sometimes what matters most isn't the weapon itself. It's the moment someone realized how to make it work. The P-38 Lightning was never meant to be perfect. It was fast, heavy, experimental. It broke records, then it broke pilots. It dove too well, it flew too far, and for a time it killed the very men it was built to protect. And yet it was not abandoned. It wasn't discarded, redesigned, or replaced. It was understood. A few civilian engineers, pencil in hand, blueprints on table, looked at a deadly flaw and asked the hardest question in engineering. What if it's not broken? What if we just don't understand it yet? Their answer wasn't a bigger engine, not a new alloy, not a major redesign. It was a small flap under the wing, designed to catch just enough air to tip the nose back towards life, and that changed everything. The dive recovery flap wasn't a miracle. It was a reminder that progress isn't always loud, that heroes don't always fly. Some sit behind drafting desks, and that the difference between tragedy and triumph can be as thin as a sheet of aluminum, bent at the right angle at the right time. The P-38 didn't win the war alone, but it became, in the hands of those who believed in it, a symbol of perseverance through problem-solving. And long after the lightning stopped flying, that spirit remained, in the minds of the men who flew faster, farther, and higher, because someone, quietly, made it safe to dive again.